May I speak in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
First of all, a great big thank you for giving me the privilege and the pleasure to come here today to preach to you, and for your very kind, warm welcome. However, I do feel slightly a fraud, because I was once a parishioner here myself 15 years ago, and this is where my Christian journey began, really, in this church. Like an acorn, I'll leave you with that thought, because I want to talk to you about a squirrel in my garden. Do you have squirrels here? Okay, so I'm not talking. For example, in the Gospel, we often hear about something called a rock badger in the Psalms. And it wasn't until I went to the Holy Land I actually discovered what a rock badger was. I'd always sort of ignored it and moved on. And so I just wanted to make sure you know what a squirrel is. As I say, my story began here. And I started to come to St. Thomas's purely because it reminded me of home, of the United Kingdom. And I felt instantly transformed, being here by myself, with no friends, no family. I was accepted by this community as part of their family. And there's a great church philosopher, talking about how do people come to faith. Well, the old analogy was you must believe, and then you belong, and then you behave, as in accordance with the gospel. But the new thought is, firstly, you must first belong to the community, and then you might start listening to what these people have to say, because you trust them. You've grown to know that these people are not a bit crazy, maybe some of us are, but you grow to believe what they're telling you, and then you start to behave as in accordance with the gospel. And I suppose in some ways that was how it was for me. Having had an Anglican background, Anglican school, I did go off the rails in my 20s, but I'm so grateful that I had that foundation. So I had something to fall back into, especially when abroad and overseas and on your own. And this is what, again, as I say, I was brought here for some reason, and I started to talk to Father Ian, who himself had only been here a couple of years then, and I remember being invited for Christmas lunch, and his mum and dad from Wales, and it was like being transported back to the UK. It was a beautiful, very kind and generous thing they did. And so Father Ian, I spoke to him about this sense of calling, this sense of urgency. I'm actually from a long line of priests. I don't know how far back it goes, but from the 1600s, Hugh Oldham was an ancestor of mine. He founded Corpus Christi in Oxford and the Manchester Grammar School, and was also the counsellor to the Queen at the time, the spiritual director to the Queen. And we've had this repeating pattern, and I don't know, there was always something inside me that thought, maybe one day that might be for me. So I told Father Ian about this, and he sent me to Malibu, God bless them right now, to a monastery. I was dreading it. You can imagine what monasteries are like in Europe. They're dark, they're grey, they're cold, they're not very pleasant places to be. But anyway, I went, and I was surprised because it's beautiful. It's up on top. I don't know if you've been. What's the name, Father Ian? Sarah Retreat, yes. And it's run by Franciscans. And a very strange thing happened to me there. I was sitting on top of it's like a big cliff or something, looking out over the sea. And I had this enormous feeling of the presence of God. Now, it wasn't that high that it could have been oxygen deprivation, but I kind of tried to write it off. But that was the beginning, really. So I then went off to do some missionary work in Africa, and I worked with people in prisons. And in Africa, where I lived at the time, was Johannesburg, there's a very high crime rate. And the reason for that is there's no social support system there. So if you have no work, you have no food. If you have no food, what do? You turn to crime. So the crime increases, the security increases, and it gets more and more and more violent, and it's a very, very frightening place to be. So these prisoners are not in prison because they stole a Snicker bar from the supermarket. They're there because they've committed some serious crimes. And they've come from the rural villages to the cities to find work. Now, the rural villages are rural Africa, where people still live in that very tribal way, with very poor English, and have never heard about Jesus or Christianity or anything like that. And so the church I was attached to, again, it was an Episcopal church, sent us in to the prisons to teach a course. It was a 10-week course, and it was called Ompumahlanga, and it means to break the chains. And we arrived, there was, let's just say, 5 of us here, escorted through door after door, clanging behind, getting deeper and deeper into this dark place. And suddenly, thrown into a big room, door slammed behind, no guards, 100 people, 5 Christians with a Bible. And these people were hardened criminals, murderers, you name it. So I was slightly concerned, as I'm sure you can imagine. But during that 10-week process, I did see God at work. I can't tell you what happened to some of those people, the change in their lives, the transformation in their lives. And it made me realize there is something to this. It's not just because I was born a Christian. There is God at work here. And so that's when I got the desire and the fire to go back to England and to go to be assessed. We have to go through a discernment process, which takes about 3 years, where you're selected to see if you're of the right character, the right mind, etc., to test your vocation. And I ended up going to study at Oxford and lived in a monastery there for 3 years, which, again, I would never have seen myself in a monastery. But it was great. I liked the discipline. I liked the morning prayer. I liked the routine. I liked knowing what was coming next. It was a good place. And also we had access to these amazing professors from all over the world. And I felt very privileged to be there. So after I finished, they then posted me to Wymondham Abbey in Norfolk, which is a Norman abbey built by the French when they invaded Britain. We don't talk about that much. And so it's a beautiful place, very historic. And you feel that sense of connection for 1,000 years. There's a track going down the marble floor as where people would have gone for communion up to the high altar. And to just walk down that track, you feel that sense of connection with the past. And you know that you're just the next link in the chain, and you're going to hand it on to the next. And then after that, I was posted to St Paul's, Knightsbridge. If you know London at all, Knightsbridge is, I guess it's a bit like Beverly Hills. It's a far cry from inner city life. But people's problems are still the same. Regardless of how much money and wealth they have, they still have the same problems. For us in Knightsbridge, a lot of it was second wives who'd married their husbands when they were, say, their husbands were 50 and they were in their 30s, and now they're babysitting and changing the nappies, and it wasn't what they imagined when they married. So you know, there's always a problem. Money is not everything, as I'm sure you're aware. But now I live in a place called Findon, and it's a rural community, and I live there with my partner, who's also a priest. We share the parish between us. Richard is a broadcaster and a journalist and an author, and he used to be a pop star. You may have heard of the Communards. Don't Leave me this way. I don't know if you've heard it, but anyway, pays my milk bill. And we decided to take a group of our parishioners to the Holy Land. I'd never been before, and I was always very pro-Israeli, because we see in the news, in the BBC, the Scud missiles being thrown over into Israel, and the Israelis, suicide bombers, and we know what that's like now because we've been there too. In London, everyone lives in fear, as I'm sure over here you have a similar feeling about it too. But when you go to the Holy Land, you realize there are two sides to the story. It is not that straightforward. This is my opinion, but the Palestinians are being pushed further and further out. Their lands are becoming smaller and smaller, and the Israelis are cutting off their main water supplies and making it impossible for them to live. In addition to that, they will not give them exit visas. So these people are now trapped with no water, no way of getting out. So you can imagine the desperation there. But what I did do whilst I was there was I went to visit Capernaum, the place we talked about today in Mark's Gospel, and the Sea of Galilee. Now, would you raise your hand if you've been to the Holy Land? Okay. I suspect you imagine it's very sandy and rocky and dry. Well, Capernaum is in the north of what we call the Holy Land, and it's very luscious, it's green, and the weather's very calm and clement. It rains and it gets cold. You know, the things you never hear in the Gospel. The Gospel writers were very, very precise about the words they used. You have to think about, they used sheepskin to write on, which was expensive, and very few people could write. So they kept their words very, very concise. And so every single word counts. You never hear, Jesus was on the Mount of Olives and it was raining and it was a bit cold. It never mentions things like that. It's to the point. It's always like that. So, going to the Sea of Galilee makes this narrative come alive. You can really see this narrative. It's real. And Capernaum still exists to this day. It was discovered, I think, about 60 years ago. And the archaeologists have said this is most definitely the place mentioned in the New Testament. And the temple where Jesus first preached, the floor, the foundations are still there. You stand on the spot where Jesus preached. It's quite an amazing feeling. And the Sea of Galilee is not really a sea at all. It's just a very big lake. And it's what they call sweet water, which to us is not salt water. And you see people there still fishing to this day. And this is where we come to in the narrative. So this is when Jesus first calls the first people. He chooses to call the fishermen. Now, that's quite surprising, really. But then God's always very surprising. God always turns things upside down. I often think if God was a cake, he'd be a pineapple upside down cake. Because you never expect what comes next with God. For example, the nativity narrative. Why was Jesus, the Son of God, born in muck, in what we call a stable, not in a palace? To a young, naive girl and a carpenter. Not how you'd expect the Messiah, not how you'd expect God to come, but that's what God always does. So the first thing here we find, he chooses fishermen. And they follow him straight away, no question. God is a God of equality. The upside down God. Also, just going back slightly, with the narrative of the nativity, we hear that the wise men are coming, the kings. And then we hear that the shepherds are coming also. Now the shepherds are known for being crooks and criminals and basically the scum. People look down on them. The way certain people look down at travellers today, Romanis, they were like that. So on the one hand you've got kings, and on the other you've got the lowest of the low being brought together because God wanted everybody to know Jesus was coming into the world, not just the elite, everybody. So who is called? Who is called? As I've said, it's not just for the elite. It's not just for the poor. Turn to the person next to you. Do you know that person next to you? That person's called. Now, if you just look at your hands, that person is called also. Because God has no hands now, according to Teresa of Avila, no feet now, no eyes now, but yours. Yours are the eyes through which Jesus is communicating with the rest of the world. God doesn't care much for riches, as we heard in the Psalms. He doesn't care that if you're that clever or not. God clearly does care about you, me, and those being drawn now to come. The seekers, I call them, not the newcomer, the seeker, as I was here 15 years ago. Today's Remembrance Sunday in the United Kingdom, and it's a big event. It's a very large event where we remember those who died, because we lost millions and millions, as I'm sure America did also. And the country stops for that one day, and we remember those who gave their lives, the greatest sacrifice of all, to lay your life down for your neighbour, as we find in Jesus' example. But this triggered a social change. A massive social reform occurred in the UK, in Great Britain after the war. As people returned home, the former lords of the land and the servants, it was the lords who said, we can't do this anymore. We've been side by side with these people. They've lost their lives. Some of us have lost our lives. We are equals. No longer can that person run around after me as if I'm something special. And it brought down that social hierarchy. Now it still exists to an extent, but it's nothing like it was. And my spiritual director, God bless his soul, Michael Stagg, he told me that when you see great darkness, it's because the light is shining brightest. And it's in the dark you look for the light, you look for the treasures. That's where they are to be found. As a consequence of all these deaths, we had a breakdown of our hierarchy, of the elitism, but we also founded social care, free care for all, from cradle to grave. That was the idea. And it brought about some good social changes. Terrible thing to go through, but sometimes when you reflect back, it's not always terrible. There's sometimes something good comes from it. I was talking to Father Ian last night while we were having supper. Father Ian is rather more academic than me. I don't know if you know the story of Martha and Mary, where Martha complains to Jesus because Mary's not helping her cook. Well, I'm afraid I'm a Martha, and Father Ian is more of a Mary. And over dinner we were discussing who were the greatest theologians. Now, I'm not very good at quizzes, so I couldn't really think of anyone. Father Ian came out with quite a list, but it reminded me of something I saw written on a wall in a tube station. And when you enter into a monastic society or community, you have a rule of life. There's usually 3 things. And written down, for me, this guy was a great theologian. His rule of life was grow things, plant that acorn. You never know what's going to happen. Coming back to my squirrel, he plants the acorns around the garden right now. He can't remember where they all are. Some of them are going to turn into great oaks. So grow things. Secondly, sing and dance. Joy. Have joy in life. And the third, try not to be rhymes with stick. Now those are the 3 rules of life I try to live by. And I'm afraid the theologian was anonymous. Father Ian also spoke last week, if you heard his sermon, that he's proud to be counted in the fraternity, the sorority, of the diverse, eclectic, and adventurous, which form our communion, global communion, and our community. We are all unique, and yet we are all part of God's family. We often have feelings of unworthiness. We doubt ourselves. Well, I'm telling you now, stop. If you doubt that you're not worthy to be counted as part of God's family, you are doubting God, because God has brought you here. Male, female, British, American, tall, short, black, white, gay, straight, brunette, or even the blondes, no offence. It's you, the individual, who make up the body of Christ. It's you. Believe. Go out in self-confidence, giving your life. Live it to your full potential. To fall short of your potential is what sin means. Live life to the fullest, believing that you are worthy of it.